Hello everyone! In this tutorial we are going to create a burnt texture. The video is divided in two parts, part 1 where we create the texture and part 2 where we create the image. Before we get started, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on your notifications. So in the first part of this tutorial, all we need is a candle, a wet sponge, and thick paper. Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Marie Luciano, and in this tutorial we will be doing a very interesting paper texture. All we need is a candle, a sponge, a wet sponge, and some paper. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, we're going to rip the paper. This was already kind of beat up anyway. Then I'm going to light the candle. I'm going to use the wet sponge to go over the part of the paper I want to burn. I'm just going to wet the edge. Okay. And then I'm going to put it over the flame. I'm not going to keep it too long so it doesn't catch on fire, because we just kind of want like a burn stain. We don't want it to burn all the way through. Get like a texture like that. I'm going to do it all the way through. And also, that's my dog, Yuma. Also, I'm going to use the same paper to do like some different textures. Because then afterwards, when I import it, I'm going to scan it, import it in Photoshop, and I'm going to separate it afterwards. So. Kind of already different. It's more burnt, that's just some texture. Now I'm going to use a different paper to make just like some burn holes. Sorry. Excuse the interruption. Okay, I'm going to do the last piece. So I'm going to wet it. This time I'm going to wet the whole thing instead started just wetting the edge. I'm going to use for now. So we did something like this burning texture, and then I used this, which is burnt all the way through. Okay, and we did this one, and this one. Okay. Now I'm going to scan them into the computer, and we'll continue. To continue with the second part of this tutorial, all we need is a scanner in Adobe Photoshop. I used a scanner to scan in the 3 textures I've created. Before you scan them in, make sure that the paper is clean and that there are no ashes on it. I'm going to start by picking one of these scans and opening it with Adobe Photoshop. Now we're going to isolate the different textures. So use the selection tool to pick one of the areas, then press Ctrl or Command C to copy it, Ctrl or Command N to create a new document, and Ctrl or Command V to paste it onto the new document. Now we're going to clean up the texture by using the brush tool. So select the brush tool, make sure the color is set on white, and cover up the undesired parts of the texture. We want to make sure that the parts of the texture that aren't burnt are covered with a full white color. This first texture that I separated already has a white background, so I don't need to clean it up. I'm going to go back to my other scans, open them in Photoshop, and repeat these steps with all the different parts of the texture. So I'm going to select the part that I want, I'm going to copy it, create a new document, paste it, and then use a white brush to clean up around the texture. Once you've separated all of your textures, create a new document. I'm creating a horizontal document because the paper I'm going to create to add my texture is going to be horizontal. I'm going to open this wood texture to use as a base. So I'm going to open it, drag it onto my document, and use it as the background. I'm going to add some adjustment layers to my background. I'm going to try different effects and choose the one I like. I'm also going to change the blending mode to multiply. Now I'm going to create the paper. So I'm going to use the rectangle tool to create a rectangle, which will be used as my paper, to which I'm going to add our burnt textures. By the way, I'm using a white rectangle for the paper because I haven't decided my image yet. But if you already have the image you want to apply the texture to, go ahead and use that instead. So once you've positioned the paper, we're going to add a drop shadow to it by clicking on Add Layer Style. I'm going to add a hue and saturation adjustment layer to give the paper kind of an antique look. When I created the white rectangle, I still hadn't decided which image to put on the paper. That's why I converted the rectangle to a smart object. That way I can replace it with any image I like. So now I'm going to open my image, I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to paste it onto my paper. Now that I'm done placing my image, I'm going to save this document and go back to my original file. Now that I changed the image, I'm going to adjust the hue and saturation layer so it looks good with my new image. So now we're going to go back to our textures and we're going to drag them onto our new image and resize and position them. Change the blending mode to multiply. That way you only see the burnt part without the white part. Now I'm going to get another burnt texture and bring it onto my image. That way I can complete the whole left edge of the paper. Once all the textures are positioned on the left side of the paper, I'm going to add a layer mask on the paper layer, and I'm going to use it to cover up the parts of the paper that continue outside of the burnt part. So you can either use a selection tool to select the parts of the paper that continue after the burnt part, or you can use a brush tool with the color black to cover it up. So when you're done selecting the paper, cover up the selection with the color black on the layer mask, and as you can see, it looks like the paper is burnt. So repeat these steps with all the other sides of the paper. So position the texture, and if necessary, you can even erase parts of the texture to make it fit in better on the paper. And then select the parts of the paper that go past the burnt part and cover them up with a layer mask. At the beginning of the second part of this tutorial, I didn't isolate all the textures from the scans, so I'm just going to do that as I go along. So I'm going to isolate them, clean them up, and then drag them onto my paper, position them, and keep doing this until I'm finished. Also, I'm going to leave some parts of the paper edge intact. I'm not gonna add the burnt texture all the way around the edges, just to make it a little bit more realistic. Now I'm going to use this texture, which is a burn hole, and I'm going to drag it onto my paper, and I'm going to position it inside on top of the paper, not on the edge. And I'm going to use the same steps. I'm going to position it, change the blending mode to multiply, and then I'm going to use the layer mask to cover up the part of the paper that shouldn't be there. I'm also going to use these other textures, which aren't like burnt edges, but they're like burnt stains. And I'm going to use them to make certain parts of the paper a little bit darker, so it looks like it was burnt, but it didn't burn all the way through. And I'm going to add some of these textures over the edge textures to make them darker. Since I didn't create a lot of textures for this tutorial, I'm going to duplicate some of them, and then I'm going to distort them or rotate them just so they don't all look alike. Finally, I'm done adding all the texture to the paper. So now I'm going to make a few more adjustments before we finish. I'm going to add a little bit of shade behind the paper. Now I'm going to go to the very top layer and go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and select Gradient Map. I'm going to change the blending mode to Overlay, and then I'm going to select the gradient map I want. Then I'm going to create a new layer, and then I'm going to use the brush tool or the gradient tool with the color black to add some dark parts, some shade. And I'm going to use the brush tool with the color white to add some highlights. And I'm going to change the blending mode on both layers. Now go down in the layer panel and select the paper layer. We're going to go back to the layer style, select gradient overlay, and we're going to add a gradient to the paper. So select the gradient map you prefer, keeping in mind that we're giving it an antique look. Change the blending mode. And when you're satisfied, press OK to close the panel. And that's it. You've created a vintage burnt paper texture from scratch. Thank you for watching. You can download this free mock-up from my website, marieluciano.com. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and found it useful. Stay tuned for more videos.